Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. And brace yourselves because we're taking on a seriously heavy topic today, suicide terrorism. Now, before you hit that skip button, I got to tell you, this is vital stuff, even if it's tough to stomach. We're really diving deep into this interview with Robert Pape, a total expert on suicide terrorism. You can find the whole interview over at the American Conservative magazine, by the way. But the really interesting thing here is Pape's built this massive database, like the biggest one out there, and what he's found really shakes up what most people think about this difficult subject. And I've got our expert here to help us unpack it all. So what was it that really jumped out at you when you first got into Pape's research?
Well, one of the most, I guess you could say, fascinating things Pape does right off the bat is he challenges this big misconception. Most people, when they hear suicide terrorism, they think Islamic fundamentalism, right? Like that's the driving force.
Right, it's almost automatic to make that connection.
Exactly. But Pape's research uncovers something really surprising. The world leaders in suicide terrorism, they're not Islamic fundamentalists at all. It's actually the Tamil Tigers.
The Tamil Tigers. Honestly, I'm not too familiar with them.
Yeah, so they're a secular Marxist group, and they're fighting for their own separate state in Sri Lanka. And here's another surprise. They're the ones who actually invented the suicide vest.
Wow, the suicide vest, something we usually picture, with extremist groups in the Middle East, actually comes from a secular group in South Asia.
It really shows how easily our assumptions about this can be turned upside down. It makes you wonder, if it's not just about religion, then what was it about the Tamil Tigers and what they were fighting for that made this tactic, as awful as it is, so effective?
It's a chilling thought for sure, but it really highlights why it's so crucial to dig deeper, to question those gut reactions we all have. So if it's not just religion pushing these attacks, what's the common denominator? What's making these groups turn to such a horrific tactic?
Pape's really clear on this. Over 95% of suicide terrorism, the goal is to force democratic states to withdraw their troops from land that these terrorists see as their homeland.
So it's about territory at its core.
Absolutely. Pape calls it a strategic objective. And you see this pattern again and again in his research. Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, Kashmir, the West Bank. Suicide terrorism, as tragic and horrifying as it is, it's often used as a tool to get to a very specific political goal.
Which, when you really think about it, goes against that argument you hear so often. The one about fighting them over there keeps us safe here at home.
And that right there, that's a major misunderstanding that Pape breaks down with his research. He doesn't see suicide terrorism as just like some random act of violence. He calls it a demand-driven phenomenon, meaning it's the presence of foreign forces on land that another group sees as their homeland that fuels these attacks. It's about pushing those occupiers out, no matter what the cost.
And this isn't just some abstract idea, right? We saw it play out with bin Laden. His whole message was focused on U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. Bin Laden never let up on that message. The U.S. military presence was a violation, a provocation. And that message, unfortunately, it resonated with some people, and it planted these seeds of resentment. And in the most extreme cases, it pushed individuals toward violence.
Which brings us to Iraq. Pape points to Iraq as probably the most stark and unsettling example of his theory in action. Because before the U.S. invasion in 2003, there were
Zero suicide attacks in Iraq. And then after the invasion, well, the numbers tell a very different and disturbing story.
And this is a really unsettling thought, but it's almost like by being there, we accidentally made these attacks more likely to happen.
And the truly scary part is, Pape's research suggests that a lot of these attackers, they weren't hardened criminals or fanatics. He calls them walk-in volunteers, meaning their very first act of violence is that suicide attack. It's not that they're looking for violence for the sake of violence, necessarily. They're driven to this extreme by what they see as a threat to their very existence, to their homeland.
And if we're talking about the groups in Iraq who were most impacted by the U.S. troop presence,
it was mainly Iraqi Sunnis and Saudis. And the real tragedy is, just by those troops being there, it became a powerful recruiting tool for extremist groups. Makes you think, doesn't it? The idea that by trying to step in and fix things, we might actually be making them worse, it really makes you question, do we even understand cause and effect in these situations?
Totally. And it makes Pape's work even more important. Because as tough as it is to face up to our own role in all this, we have to be willing to talk about it, if we ever want to find a way out of this cycle of violence.
And that's really what Pape's pushing for. He's not trying to say these acts are okay or justified, but he is making us confront some uncomfortable truths about what leads to them.
And one of the most uncomfortable ones he brings up is that this isn't just history, right? Pape leaves us with a pretty sobering question about the future.
He does. He asks straight up, how long are U.S. troops going to stay in the Persian Gulf? And what risks does that pose for more attacks down the line? It's something we should all be thinking about.
It's such a big question, like where do you even start to answer that? What would it actually take to make future attacks less likely in those parts of the world?
Well, if we're following Pape's logic, a big part of the answer is rethinking this whole idea of sending in the military. Stationing tons of troops in places where other groups feel like it's their land, especially with all the religious and cultural differences, it just makes things way more volatile.
He even suggests that the way the U.S. handled its oil interests back in the 70s and 80s, before we had troops permanently stationed in the Gulf, that might actually be a smarter approach in the long run.
Exactly. He calls it offshore balancing. Basically, it means still having a strong military presence, but not right there on the ground. We'd rely on alliances with local powers, using aircraft carriers strategically, and having bases that let us deploy quickly if we need to.
So it's like we're showing we're strong and ready to respond if necessary, but without creating that resentment, that feeling of being occupied, that leads to more problems.
Right. It's a really interesting argument because it challenges what we usually think about military action, which is often just sending in troops. Pape's asking us to consider something different.
But wouldn't pulling back like that make us vulnerable? Wouldn't it, encourage these groups if they think we're weak or unsure of ourselves?
Yeah, that's a common worry, for sure. But Pape says, if you look at the historical data, that's not what happens. Remember when we were talking about Lebanon? How the suicide attacks dropped significantly after the U.S. and French troops left?
Right, and the same thing happened during the Second Intifada, when Israel promised to withdraw. So it's not like withdrawing makes all the terrorists vanish into thin air.
Exactly. It's about taking away their biggest recruiting tool, which is the occupation itself. When people don't feel occupied, it's harder to sell them on the idea of violent resistance. You make that message a lot less powerful.
So if there's no one to resist, it's a lot tougher to justify violence.
And hopefully that opens the door for other solutions.
Right.
Diplomatic ones, economic ones, things that actually address the root causes of extremism.
Which isn't to say that those other solutions are easy or guaranteed to work, but at least they've got a shot if you can stop the cycle of violence, if you can take the pressure off.
Exactly. And that's what makes Pape's research so important. It makes us ask these really tough questions about what our foreign policy choices are really costing us, about the consequences, which are often unintended and far-reaching.
It's easy to get caught up in the moment, to react emotionally, to say we need more military action without really thinking about the long-term impact.
Absolutely. And what Pape is urging us to do, all of us, is to think beyond those gut reactions, to look at the patterns throughout history and ask, what are we actually accomplishing? Are we really making things safer? Or are we creating more danger in the process?
And those are questions for everyone, not just the politicians and the people making the decisions. This affects all of us. But it's also important to remember that suicide terrorism, it's not the only type of political violence out there. Pape talks about the IRA, for example. They never used suicide terrorism, even though they were clearly willing to use violence, even deadly violence, to get what they wanted. What's different there? Why wouldn't a group like the IRA, with their history of bombings and assassinations, use suicide attacks?
That's a key distinction, and it gets at Pape's argument that suicide terrorism is a last resort, something groups often choose when nothing else seems to be working.
So the IRA, they were dealing with a different situation. They weren't trying to force a foreign power out of what they saw as their land. Their fight was with the British government, and it was about the political status of Northern Ireland.
Right. And in that context, the IRA found other ways, horrific as they were, to try to reach their goals. They bombed civilians, they assassinated politicians, they had armed clashes with British security forces. These tactics, as awful as they were seen as more effective in their particular struggle.
Because they had a different objective.
Yeah.
It wasn't about forcing a large-scale withdrawal. It was about putting pressure on a government that had to answer to its own people, to public opinion.
Exactly. Their goal was to force the British government to negotiate, to make it too costly for them to hold on to Northern Ireland. Suicide terrorism, on the other hand, it often aims at a much bigger global audience. It's about grabbing the world's attention and using that as leverage.
Like the IRA were fighting on one island, while groups like al-Qaeda are trying to, reshape the whole world.
That's a good way to put it. Different goals, different battlefields, different strategies.
And it makes Pape's main point even more, unsettling. Because if suicide terrorism is often a response to being occupied, then it's not just some problem over there. It's a problem we have to think about in terms of our own decisions about foreign policy.
And that's a tough conversation to have. It forces us to think about our place in the world differently. It's not enough to just say, terrorism is bad. We have to be willing to look at what creates it, even if that's hard to face.
Pape doesn't exactly give us easy answers, does he?
Yeah.
He's really pushing us to accept how complicated this is, to not oversimplify.
He does, and I think one of the most important things to take away from his research is that there's not just one solution, no quick fix. It's about understanding the specifics, the history, why people are doing this. It's about really dealing with those uncomfortable truths we were talking about.
It's so easy to just boil suicide terrorism down to something simple, to blame it on religious fanatics or, just plain evil. But Pape's work shows us it's much more complex and interconnected than that.
It really is. And maybe the hardest part to accept is that sometimes our own actions can actually contribute to the problem we're trying to solve. We've got to ask those tough questions. Is what we're doing really making us safer in the long run? Or are we just causing more anger, more chaos, more fertile ground for extremism to grow?
Which takes us right back to that final question from Pape, the one that really sticks with you. How long will U.S. troops stay in the Persian Gulf? And what happens if they do? What are the risks?
It's a question that should matter to everyone, not just the people in charge, but anyone who wants a more peaceful world.
Because the future depends on what we decide to do now. It depends on whether we're willing to look past the easy answers, to really see the uncomfortable realities, and to demand better solutions from our leaders. So to everyone listening, we urge you, check out the full interview with Robert Pape. It's challenging, it makes you think, but most importantly, it might just change how you see one of the biggest issues of our time. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.